Next up, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Todd Bridges. He is the U.S. Army's Senior Research Scientist for Environmental Science. Responsibilities include leading research, development, and environmental initiatives for the U.S. Army and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, including the Army Corps' Engineering with Nature program, which includes a network of research projects, field demonstrations, and communication activities to promote sustainable, resilient infrastructure systems. Dr. Bridges led efforts on the use of natural and nature-based features to support coastal resilience within the Army Corps' North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study following Hurricane Sandy, and currently leads multiple activities related to natural and nature-based features development.
Testing coordination. Thank you very much, Shannon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I had a happy coincidence or convergence of events. Previous speaker mentioned Goldman Sachs. I met people with Goldman Sachs yesterday in New York City, and I have some show and tell. Caterpillar Corporation, of all people, or all of the company, hosted they called it a summit yesterday in New York City called Restoring Natural Infrastructure. About 100 participants, including folks from Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, Price Cooper's Waterhouse, Ernst & Young, et cetera, et cetera. The panel that I was on is actually chaired by a fellow from J.P. Morgan Chase. One of the themes of the event was how the private sector and government can interact more effectively in these kinds of projects. What are the business models to promote them? How can they be financed and funded, maybe not just through traditional government-based mechanisms, but also through tapping into opportunities, of course, to make money. And there are, in fact, opportunities to do that. So I'm glad to be here and talk on this subject, which is quite important within the practice of the Corps of Engineers in the lakes, of course, as well as elsewhere around our coastline. I'm also a fan of history, and I'm going to use several examples that maybe don't particularly resonate so much with the Great Lakes setting, but hopefully we'll be able to draw some connections to analogs that do resonate with you. But I was using this particular example recently in a series of talks. I was in Australia and New Zealand last month speaking on these exact topics on the other side of the globe. The deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history was the hurricane of 1900, which devastated Galveston Island. Again, the city of Galveston, in fact, at the time was one of 3 population centers in the state of Texas. It was equivalent in size, about 40,000 people roughly, to the city of Houston and the city of Dallas. They were all the same size. And arguably, Galveston was in fact a commercial center of the state of Texas because of the port. The port in Galveston dwarfed what existed in Houston at the time, at 1900. The surge was around 15 feet, it's estimated. The highest natural elevation on Galveston Island at the time, about 9 feet. The best estimate for the number of deaths is 8,000 people died that day and the days following. So many dead, in fact, that a traditional burial was impossible, so funeral pyres burned on Galveston Island for weeks, day and night, as neighbors and family members burned their relations and friends after the event. That'll make an impression on our community. And so after that event, a panel was commissioned. It was actually chaired by a former chief of engineers, Brigadier General Robert. And they came up with the Robert Plan, which included the construction of the Galveston seawall. At ASCE, it's on the Historic Registry of Engineered Features. If you've ever been there, it's quite an impressive structure. This 15 feet tall concrete structure. Okay? They built, in fact, the first 3 miles of this structure within just a couple of years' time. But then over about 60 years, constructed what now is in excess of 10 miles of seawall by this same design. Behind the seawall, using dredge equipment, they pumped and raised the elevation of the forward-facing part of the island by 15 feet with sand in order to create this level of protection. This picture is taken in 1911 at the opening of the Hotel Galvez. I stayed there last month at the meeting of the Corps' Coastal Engineering Research Board, which is hosted by Galveston. It's an impressive structure. But you can see this woman here dressed in fine attire, according to 1911 style. She's walking on the seawall right in front of the Hotel Galvez. So you build a structure like that seawall, and what do? You develop right behind it, right? So that hotel sits exactly 100 yards from the seawall itself. It was constructed, that particular hotel, for the whopping sum of $1 million, which was a lot of money at that time. It's a very impressive place. It's a beautiful structure. So let's flash forward to another event, that Hurricane Sandy, which precipitated a lot of interest in natural infrastructure, if you will, or what we in the Corps are calling natural nature-based features. This figure comes from the City of New York's report. If you can see it, it's maybe a little tough from the back, but we've got two beaches here at 56th Street and at 94th Street on Rockaway Peninsula, before Sandy and then after Sandy. The differences between these two beaches is that this beach has a dune and this beach didn't have a dune. And you can look here at the kind of invasion of sand right onto the land side of that beach as an indicator of how much water was also moving over that land with the 13-foot surge at this portion. Very little movement of sand, and in fact, very little movement of water, in fact, shoreward on this beach. In large measure due to the slope of this beach as well as the dune that's there. This beach was constructed initially by the Corps in the 1970s. It was a beach construction project. It was last nourished, supported in 2004. And at that time, the New York City Parks put sand fencing in place, which captured, wind-driven particles of sand, which resulted in the development of those dune features, which then vegetated over time. So an example of natural infrastructure. The epilogue to this story, in the years for Galveston, the years preceding the hurricane of 1900, Galveston was developing rapidly, lots of construction. The natural dunes on the beaches of Galveston were purposefully and deliberately removed. The material was actually used to fill low-lying areas on the island to support construction projects. And it was also thought that removing the dunes was conducive to tourism because it provided more ready access for tourists to the beach. Hurricane Sandy work that was mentioned. The North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study, what we call the NACS affectionately, was commissioned by Congress, a $20 million study the Corps was directed to conduct by Congress to evaluate opportunities to reduce coastal risk and enhance coastal resilience following Hurricane Sandy. This report, final report of the study, was issued in January of this year. It's available at the website down at the bottom of the slides, and Shannon and Heather will have all these slides and make them available to you later, so you don't need to copy too much down. One of the main aspects that I was involved with the study during its duration was what we called the incorporation of natural and nature-based features into coastal infrastructure. I led a group of 30 engineers and scientists in this effort over about a year and a half. We developed somewhat of a tome of a report at the time. I've said several times if we had another year, we could have made it shorter. But, such as it was, we had the time we had available to us. And I'm going to go over some elements of that. But preceding that, in September of 2013, so before the anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, the Corps wrote down what its position was on natural and nature-based features. And our approach, which I'll show in a moment, is how to integrate, an integration of these kinds of features with what we might think of as conventional infrastructure. There's some people who want to pit one against the other, contrasting. I'm not sure that's such a useful way to proceed in discussion about this, but more how to integrate. I think the discussion this morning has been along those lines, right? How to integrate conventional infrastructure where it's needed with natural or nature-based approaches. These are the kind of features that are highlighted in these documents I've just shown you, including what was previously mentioned, very important. Beach dune complexes are very important and underappreciated. We, in fact, at ERDEC and USACE and USGS partnered with ASBPA just last week in a workshop out at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, specifically focused on dunes. Dune engineering, dune construction. Dunes, I think, are highly underappreciated for their importance in the United States, for the value they provide, not from just an engineering perspective, but for the environmental and the ecosystem values that dunes provide. And it's deserving of much more emphasis, and hopefully we'll build momentum from last week's workshop, which was originally designed for 50 people and went above 100 because of the interest in those projects. But I think we all get the kinds of features. I will include, because it's been referenced already this morning, the importance of forests. Larger plants than the grasses, if you will, that we might typically associate with these kinds of features. A forest can divert more surge and attenuate more waves than a typical grass species is going to. And there may be some places, certainly on the, the marine coast, where that's important and applicable. This is just an excerpt from this document that gets to our statement of this sort of integrated approach. There are going to be differences as to, how much emphasis or weight can be placed on natural, nature-based versus conventional infrastructure. It's going to vary by context, of course, but our emphasis is on the integration, not the either-or. And this is in the context of another word that's been used several times, I think, already this morning, this idea of resilience, which I guess is the buzzword du jour for the last few years. But I think there is real meaning there. It's not just a buzzword thing. But if you look at the literature, there are literally hundreds of definitions of resilience. They use it in electrical infrastructure. It's used everywhere. In ecology, certainly as well. And we've been doing work within the Corps of Engineers to kind of define this meaning in some tangible form that's applicable to the things that we're doing. I guess I don't want to go into this diagram too much, just to make a point that's already been emphasized through many of the examples, that the systems we're working with are dynamic. And though we want to pursue concepts and intentions that we use words like stabilize, these are dynamic systems. And so the approaches I think that we need to use more and think about more is how we can build infrastructure, natural infrastructure, that is more harmonious, if you will, with the idea of the dynamism that's characteristic of this land-water interface that we're concerned with here. So in this context of coastal resilience, this barrier island, the country in the world that has the most barrier islands, anybody want to hazard a guess? The United States of America. I know it's maybe not so applicable to the Great Lakes, but I think by last count we have 405 barrier islands in the United States, by far more than any other country on the planet. But how do we use these kind of integrated approaches to produce better alignment, reduce risks? What range of services, including ecosystem services, is that a useful frame for us? I think it is, for considering how to pursue these kinds of opportunities. And then importantly, for purposes of many of our discussions this morning, what are the science and engineering needs, gaps that need to be filled or addressed in some fashion with guidance to be able to promote these kinds of approaches? These kind of figures are quite boring, but it was a useful device for us in developing the natural nature-based features report that we produced for Sandy, is to develop a framework of how to think about these opportunities. And in fact, many of the organizations that we solicited comments and feedback from, including folks in the NGO community and sister agencies and government, gave us a lot of positive feedback on just helping to frame the thought process of how you identify, evaluate, and then pursue through transition implementation of these options. So I guess one source of advice I guess I would give in context here is don't cut past this somewhat boring step, because it's useful in organizing your energies and putting them where it needs to be. One of the things that we were exposed to readily, there was so much interest in this topic area in the context of Sandy. We had a couple of different technical meetings to solicit input. This is these are the logos for only a portion of the organizations that participated in our main technical workshop that we held while we were developing this framework. It just ran the gamut. Everybody was interested in it. And I think now is a very useful time to pursue these kinds of opportunities because there are a lot of stars aligned. A lot of people are paying attention to natural infrastructure, i.e., a 100,000 person corporation called Caterpillar, and they're not the only ones thinking about this. This point has already been made, so I won't spend much time here, but we spend a lot of time talking about different physical contexts. Geomorphology matters, and what is going to work in one context is not going to necessarily work in another context. So definitely there's no one-size-fits-all silver bullet, pick your metaphor for these kinds of approaches. And it has to be based, as was emphasized this morning, on the right processes, and processes that will support and sustain the solution over time. We did spend some time thinking about how you'd go about evaluating from an engineering perspective these integrated approaches, and this slide just makes two simple points that we envision needing a kind of a tiered approach for these kinds of evaluations. If you got to deploy the supercomputer every time, right, you want to put one of these kinds of projects in place, you're not going to construct many projects, right? So thinking about how to do this in a tiered fashion that will facilitate the planning and the permitting and the engineering design, I think is a useful thing to think about as you move forward with guidance or a plan of attack. I also mentioned that we took in our report an ecosystem services-based concept for how to evaluate the performance of these systems. We, as was I think articulated several times this morning, have multiple objectives we're trying to achieve with these kinds of approaches, right? Engineering performance are very important, but then there are other services we'd like to derive from these systems as well, from the social as well as the environmental point of view. And we spent some time talking about tools and identifying some case studies. Sediment is a resource, very well emphasized in the previous talk. We have a lot of sediment out there, for example, in our navigation program in the Corps of Engineers. And this is an example where we're using optimization tools, in this case was in Central Long Island Sound, to inform a stakeholder process where they were trying to identify new ways in which they could be using sediments as opposed to using the old, store it and forget about it methods of the past. I think that's relevant in the lakes. A lot of history of using confined disposal facilities in the Great Lakes. Back in the 70s and maybe in the 80s and such, where there was such a huge problem with contaminated material, that made a lot of sense. I think while there are places where that's still an issue, it is much less an issue than it was at the time. Removing sediment from the water, all else being equal, is a bad idea. And that's one of my rules of thumb. Sediment should be managed in water unless there's a credible and substantial reason to do otherwise. I guess you can quote me on it, but I've quoted it enough to others. We have an Engineering with Nature program that I'll summarize here. This is just the operational definition of it. We're trying to find ways in which we can align natural processes with engineering processes to deliver a broader range of benefits from these kinds of techniques and approaches. These ideas have been around for decades and decades and decades. We're trying to actually translate them into our practice within the Corps and those with whom we work. It applies across our programs within the Corps. These are just some examples I'm giving here. We started in the context of navigation, have a lot of sediment examples, but there are other contexts for us as well, like water operations and flood risk management, ecosystem restoration, and some brief examples that illustrate the types of approaches that are worthwhile. We've been at this for a few years now, since 2010 when we started this program, which I've been leading within the Corps with a lot of help and support and a broad team across the Corps of Engineers. We put a lot of emphasis on the social dynamics, which referenced this morning as well. You've got to get people together to think about these opportunities in events just like this. This is how I think we've been able to make progress in the program. You get people together to think, create, imagine how they could do things differently, and that's the key to making progress. There are different contexts for pursuing these kind of projects. In a recent, conversation a few years ago, I was trying to create some more metaphors for some of my coastal engineering colleagues, and I said, this is like coastal engineering jujitsu. Right? That is, we're trying to use our opponents, if you want to think of natural forces as our opponents, our opponents' energy and force and power to our benefit. How can we do that? And I think with regard to sediment processes, that point was made multiple times this morning. I won't go into this too much. Get to some specific examples. This was already referenced. We have to support natural sediment processes if the features we're interested in rely on sediment, which so many of them do. And these are some examples of what we call, or are calling now, strategic sediment placement. We are putting sediment in one place in the water with the expectation it's going to go somewhere else where you want it, right? And Mother Nature is supplying the energy to do that. And so these are some, beach nourishment projects where sediment is being placed in the near shore, or maybe in some cases in the offshore, to be able to support the sediment supply that's needed by that beach. There are many of these examples, and we're interested in pursuing others as well. Here's an example you may be familiar with. It's on a very large scale in the Netherlands. I've walked on this feature myself, but in 2011, to address coastal shoreline protection issues, this is the Port of Rotterdam down here, to address coastal protection issues, and they decided that they would conduct an experiment, a rather large experiment. Rather than conducting a series of small beach nourishments over a protracted period of time, they decided to do one large beach nourishment project. This project was constructed in 2011, where they placed 21 million cubic meters of sediment over about a 9-month period of time. 21 million cubic meters of sediment in this feature. And this is it right here. This is what you see soon after construction. Here's this feature as it has continued to evolve over time, right? This is the direction here of longshore transport of sediment in this system. And extensive amount of monitoring they're conducting, and interested in identifying the kind of economy of scale and the savings that they're gaining from this one-time large investment in beach nourishment as opposed to the kind of incremental approach to doing it. Very interesting experiment. The jury's still out on this as they collect data relevant to this project. This is an example of engineering with nature to support ecosystems as well as engineering. I don't even know what time I started here, but you'll give me the hook. Okay. But this is on the Gulf Coast. This is the Atchafalaya River and a place called Horseshoe Bend. We were running out of places. The Core New Orleans district was running out of places to create wetlands along the banks in order to manage dredge material from this navigation channel. And based on their understanding of how the river was working, they were confident that they placed sediment upstream of a natural sand shoal, that they could actually get that sediment to accumulate in that area, and they would grow habitat. And that's exactly what they did. Over about a 10-year period, they created about 100 acres of diverse wetland habitat simply from placing the sediment in the river and letting the river itself engineer the feature. There's no diking, there's no rock, there's none of that. The river engineered the feature. Here are some pictures just taken of this, and there's a lot of species diversity, 80 species of plants. The vast majority of them are natives. It's not like a weed patch out there. A lot of birds and other species, alligators. And based on the number of spent shotgun shells out on the island itself, there's recreators, Cajuns we call them, down there. And this particular project was awarded the Western Dredging Association's 2015 Award for Environmental Excellence in Practice. Dredging companies in the New Orleans district and ERDEC working with them to document this case example. And they're producing engineering benefits. Before they made this modification in practice, the channel actually went to the west side of this shoal. And when the feature developed, the natural channel moved to the east side of the shoal, which is actually a better alignment for shipping and navigation in that context. And it's also resulting in less dredging need. They say the New Orleans district calculates about $1 million in the last several years in reduced dredging needs because of that modification in operational practice. So that's a triple bottom line win, from a sustainability perspective. Buffalo examples. Buffalo District has been working very well interfacing with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and several other partners, which I'm not in a good position to document all of them, but includes the Nature Conservancy and others. Incorporating habitat into hard structures, in this case for common tern and Ashtabula Harbor, with taking advantage of some need to rehabilitate this breakwater. They modified some tow blocks to incorporate tern habitat. And in this case, using smaller rock at the toe of breakwater in Milwaukee Harbor to accommodate a fish habitat for bass and other species. And there are other examples of these. And there are, I think, great opportunities here given the number of, hard structures that exist in the lakes. In the context of dredging projects, in this case, a deepening project that our Boston office, the New England district, they're going to be dredging a lot of rock in a deepening project in Boston Harbor, and so their question, working with the Nature Conservancy actually, is how they might use that rock to attenuate waves in the vicinity, as well as to create conditions behind these, we call them here sills or berms offshore, create conditions where habitat that maybe has been lost, for example, seagrasses and others, could be restored by creating the physical conditions necessary to support those kinds of features. And these features, this gets to the ecosystem service site, are quite important. Plover was mentioned earlier today. The NOAA actually recently designated with Fish and Wildlife Service 685 miles of southeast Atlantic and Gulf beaches as critical habitat for loggerhead turtles. We're a little concerned about what that means to beach nourishment projects, right? Given the kind of coordination, sometimes slow coordination that's necessary. And so we're trying to get ahead of that curve and figure out ways that we can incorporate design elements to support species like loggerhead turtle or red knot, longest migratory pattern of any bird species on the planet, and others as well. I mentioned I was in Australia and New Zealand last month, and this is a picture of one of these projects. I toured several coastal projects when I was in New Zealand. This is a place called Piha, which is on the western coast of New Zealand. You go 1,000 miles this way and you hit Australia. That's a black sand beach, and beautiful area, but they've had some issues and are trying to address those issues with natural infrastructure. In this particular case, this dune here is a constructed engineered dune, which they vegetated to address. And if you went about 100 yards this way, we've got people living in houses. So you've got this constructed dune. The community is really engaged in maintaining that feature over time. Regulatory context. This project in Tampa Bay, this island is owned by the Audubon Society, and they came to the Corps with a permit request. They wanted to put in this case, these reef ball structures, right? These hollow concrete form structures that provide habitat but also can attenuate waves. So the Jacksonville district was the permitting authority in this particular case. It was 930 feet of offshore, we would say, maybe near shore, using the terms earlier, to attenuate waves, because this island was essentially dissolving away that Audubon owned, and they wanted to maintain this habitat. I mentioned the social aspects. We actually have 3 districts now, but 2 of our first districts that are engineering with nature proving grounds, one of them is Buffalo. And I'm very proud of Buffalo District myself because of the energy with which they are pursuing these kinds of opportunities since becoming one of the engineering with nature proving grounds in the last year, a whole portfolio of projects where they're pursuing these kinds of opportunities. And I would invite you to engage, Tony's here and others, to find ways in which we can pursue these. And we've kicked these all off with events like this to kind of stimulate ideas on how to implement these kinds of practices across the entire portfolio of the district's programs. Galveston is the other. The 3rd district that's just come online now is Philadelphia District. These are some examples. Demonstration projects are very important, and we've been working with Philadelphia District with the state of New Jersey, helping the state of New Jersey accept these modifications and practices. This gets to my question earlier about regulatory hurdles, if you will. to use thin layer placement of sediments to raise elevation for sinking wetlands. Another case where we're working with the Nature Conservancy on a project doing just this. And working with the Fish and Wildlife Service at one of their wildlife refuges where they have a variety of conditions at their wetlands, some of them sinking and degraded for a variety of reasons, and they want to use sediments from the navigation program to do this, but the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't employ a lot of engineers, not surprisingly. So how to do this is their question. So we have an interagency agreement with them to help support them in that. Soon to come online, we're putting a bunch of resources together that describe thin layer placement of sediment. What we mean by that is using engineering to place centimeter lifts of sediment as opposed to meter lifts. And anybody can build a pile meters high of sediment, right? But a little bit different when you're just trying to build centimeters of lift. And so there are a lot of projects that meet this condition, and what we're bringing together is basically an electronic library of reports and descriptions of practice that can be used to accomplish that. I'm not going to go into this at all. It's just included for completeness. We have put together a lot of demonstration projects, which again I think are very key. We need to give ourselves license or permission to pursue these modifications of practice and these innovations so we can learn from that. It's kind of hard to convince everybody based on theory and modeling studies, but if you could actually do it on the ground and collect data to show that you did it, right, you probably have a compelling case to persuade somebody. And we have these projects all around the country, a limited set of them. One I'd point out that resonated with comments earlier is we made an investment in developing an actual engineering guide on the use of large wood in restoration. This is something that we did with the Bureau of Reclamation, so the Corps of Engineers and DOR, and this document is like a couple of weeks from being on the street, and it might be of interest to you all given the discussions this morning. There are several technical issues broadly categorized here. How will integrated infrastructure systems evolve over time? You know, these are long-term projects. That's an important question, especially when you think about the O&M of these projects. What processes and engineering requirements are critical to performance? We need to identify those. How can integrated systems be assembled to reduce long-term O&M for seawalls, for example? If we have a beach, if we don't have a beach now, but we only have a seawall, would putting a beach in front of that seawall reduce the O&M for that seawall or extend the life of that seawall? Then maybe it would be justifiable to consider putting a beach someplace that you don't have one now. And how can field-scale demonstration projects be used to accelerate progress? Last slide. So, at a very high level, it's important to develop a coherent vision. I think a lot of times we stall out because we don't have that, right? And I think somebody made reference earlier to semantics. I'm one of these word policemen things. I think the words that we use to describe these opportunities actually do kind of matter. There's a lot of ambiguity out there. And so I think it's worth sometimes thinking about what words, how we choose to describe these opportunities. We need to recognize that we're engaging in some innovation, and there are some risks and uncertainties that are attendant to taking more innovative practices, so you have to manage that. There's a lot of value, I think, in making investments and trying to elevate communication about advancing practice, and events like this are one way of doing that. We've got to share with others what our intent is and what progress we're making if we actually want to make progress. And then accelerating progress through what some of us have been calling co-development of solutions, where different organizations are working together on solutions. I think that's quite a powerful mechanism for building the constituency and proponency for these kinds of practices. So with that, I conclude. I thank you for your time, and hopefully I didn't go too much over my time. Okay, thanks. And I did want to mention, I was the one who dropped these little brochures off. We put this together as a way to try to draw attention to our tome of a report, so I'd invite you to pick them up if you didn't earlier. And if you have some feedback on ways we could improve it, that would be great too. And also, Buffalo District had a brochure they put out highlighting some of their work on engineering with nature. And again, I'm sure they would appreciate feedback if you had some to offer. All right. A question, a comment, or a rebuttal? Everybody should feel, when I said rebuttal, like 7 hands went up all at one time. Pardon? Yeah, I'll repeat the question. I'll go front, yeah. Yeah. Well, so the question was, in terms of thin layer placement, are we looking to do this year after year? Probably not, right? If you have a wetland that, because of subsidence over the last 30 years now, is not in its ideal position, if you put another 18 inches there to raise elevation, I don't think you have to come back next year to put another 18 inches down, right? It took 35 years or whatever it was to reduce that. It's going to vary on what the purpose is. If you're trying to build a mud flat or restore a mudflat environment in an area, you have to understand the physical processes, right? It's probably not sustainable if you're having to come back every year with another 6 inches of sediment. That would probably require a lot of money. But there are places where we don't need a lot to be able to get value, and where the threshold is a narrow one, and wetlands are the prime example of that. How thick is thin? When we're just saying centimeters. It's going to vary, right? So it's less than a meter, Yeah. Right. Yeah, you don't want to, obviously that's kind of the nuance of it. You want to help the wetland, you don't want to smother the wetland, right? And the margins are important here because you can raise it so high that you don't have, you got an upland rather than a wetland. So it raises monitoring issues and techniques and how we're finding to deal with this. Another question?
I just wanted to observe that you see some very successful examples, I think, today so far. But they seem to rely largely on either external requirements for environmental performance or a small number of involved individuals who have the expertise in order to pull those off. And what we really want is two things. We want to develop a general expectation that these kinds of environmentally beneficial outcomes will be preferable. Secondly, we want to develop a body of practice in the design community that is able to carry these kinds of things out. So I just wondered if you would comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying you want and need, I think, is correct. I guess what I would point out is that individuals matter when you're trying to transition a practice or you're in the process of a more innovative stage of activity. Individuals maybe matter less when it comes to designing a standard seawall, right? Because that's such a well-established practice. But when you're trying to push an envelope or a boundary in some fashion, sometimes having the right 1 or 2 or 3 individuals is kind of the difference between succeeding in the project or not. But as it becomes more established in practice, you're having to rely less, hopefully, on those key individuals.
Well, I would just like to add that, only speaking from a course point of view, there's all kinds of people who might help. To the degree that this group, wherever you all land, to the degree that you want our help, we also want to help. And we have some ability to do that without any cost or just we would like to be able to offer assistance in those areas where we're asked and welcome. So we have such a big interest in all this succeeding. We want to be available if we're asked. We will certainly help. Others can also add so much more to it. I know we set aside a way to do that over the next several years.
One of the stated objectives by Caterpillar yesterday, for example, was to stimulate the development of a community on this topic. And I think that gets to part of your point, that maybe something that is anticipated here. If you can establish a community of practice in this topic area, I think you'll be able to achieve your intentions and rely less on some unique personality that is required to make the project happen. Yep. Sure.
Todd, is ERDAC doing any research currently on new or emerging materials or techniques for doing the types of shoreline stabilization or habitat creation projects that you've mentioned today? I was really pleased to see that concept of reef balls. It's the first time I've heard of anything other than just putting rock out there. So those types of new or emerging techniques, I'd be interested in.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a very good question. So the question was, is ERDAC working on some new gizmos and techniques to help stimulate this kind of practice? I think with respect to thin layer placement, I think we're establishing some new practices by working with contractors and such in Philadelphia district, because these things aren't standardized. And so you got to be out there with the contractor at the time, in some cases, to improvise. And we want to document those kinds of, practices and inventions. Because the equipment, the dredging equipment has evolved in this country for an entirely different purpose than some of the purposes we want to achieve, for these kinds of projects. I have a colleague in regards to stabilization work who's developed a biopolymer that can be sprayed on soil that reduces the potential for erosion in that soil and actually stimulates root development in plants. And he's been using this on military installations and in connections with levees. There's no voodoo to it. I've seen this stuff work. It's fantastic stuff. So that would be an example of that kind of practice. So yeah, that kind of work is going on. But hopefully through demonstrations within your community here, and that's one of the, I guess, the encouragements or exhortations I would give you is to document what you guys are able to do over time, because that's a way of not only stimulating more activity within your own community, but it can be shared with others elsewhere. Just because it's going on lakes doesn't mean it wouldn't be relevant to the Gulf Coast or someplace else in the same context.